I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
Coming up, a new president.
To make the Alaska agenda happen, we've got to ride every wave that hits us.
Or what Alaska Natives fear could be a tsunami of change they won't like.
Native people do not roll over. They continue to fight.
Also ahead, on the eve of the Trump administration, why two tribes gather to celebrate progress on a federal land deal.
Sponsorship for Frontiers with Rhonda McBride is provided by your local Alaska Toyota dealers. Toyota, let's go places. Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers. With challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief the best is yet to come. Bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to our program. You might say every new president is like creating a new frontier for our state, especially when you consider the federal government is Alaska's biggest landlord with control of more than 60% of our land. As for Donald Trump, in just 1 week on the job, we already feel the impact.
We are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
A new president already out to make waves.
To make the Alaska agenda happen, we've got to ride every wave that hits us. I think that we've got several waves we can ride with the Trump administration. We've got the trade wave, we've got the energy wave, we've got the infrastructure wave.
When you talk about riding this wave, it's hard for people to think about jumping onto another wave when they don't support that person.
I understand. The Alaska agenda has to be paramount to us, no matter who's president.
Meade Treadwell served as chair of the Arctic Research Commission under George W. Bush and for a short time under Barack Obama. He was one of the early voices to sound the alarm on climate change, voices that Trump's administration has sought to suppress.
First off, I think President Trump has done the world a service by saying this, that some of these things that people think are going to change the weather are not going to change the weather. They're just going to make government bigger.
Treadwell says Trump is a welcome change after President Obama's efforts to kill offshore oil drilling.
We Alaskans have to make our own weather. You know, we have a president who believes in producing energy. We have a president who believes in building infrastructure. We have a president who believes that we should be selling more to Asia because they're selling us too much and we're not selling them enough. Let's take advantage of those big trends.
28,000 jobs. Great construction jobs.
Trump has already signed an executive order to resurrect the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines. Alaska protesters this week backed the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's plans to fight the Dakota project in court, a sharp contrast from the Obama administration's strong relationship with the tribes.
I believe the tribal consultation process is incredibly important, but the rest of us are not chopped liver. That's why we have laws that say you need to have a process.
Native people do not roll over. They continue to fight. They continue to be active in their advocacy.
Heather Kendall Miller, a longtime attorney for the Native American Rights Fund, says tribes are political entities with sovereign status.
It's a serious thing for tribes now to think that their ability to consult with federal agencies may be rolled back, because it has made a difference. It's made a big difference in terms of agency planning.
I met Alaska Natives whose...
President Obama has been one of the strongest advocates of tribal consultation.
For a sitting U.S. president to recognize Indigenous people's way of life, to actually come and experience what we're working so hard to protect, experience our culture with us, was history for this entire country.
You see that?
Alana Hurley held up a salmon for President Obama during his visit to Bristol Bay. Under his watch, the Environmental Protection Agency used the Clean Water Act to block Pebble Mine.
For Indigenous people to have that caliber and character within a sitting president with a shift into this new administration is definitely challenging.
But Hurley hopes Trump's business agenda will find favor with the Bristol Bay salmon industry's ability to create jobs.
Over 14,000 American jobs.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
If this first week is any sign of the new president's wave of change, Alaskans can expect one wild ride. Ahead, a transition between two very different philosophies. Alaskans voice their views on how President Trump will affect Alaska's economy and its ability to cope with climate change. Presidents have played a big role in Alaska history. Richard Nixon supported the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Jimmy Carter signed a Lands Conservation Act, which set aside more than 100 million acres of federal land for parks and refuges. And Bill Clinton's Assistant Interior Secretary, Ada Deer, gave Alaska villages tribal status. And Barack Obama gave momentum to tribal consultation and climate change awareness. As for Donald Trump, Alaskans, whether they like him or not, are not quite sure how he'll make his mark on our state.
Trump, to me, is too dictatorial.
I mean, this is the best thing that's happened to Alaska in a long time.
Especially with a president that leans toward development and is pro-business, that he can have a big impact on Alaska.
I'm not sure whether it'll end up being positive or negative for us, but I'm hopeful.
President Trump won the vote in Alaska by more than 50%. And joining us now to talk about the transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, Beth Kotula, and many of us know you for your work representing Juneau in the state legislature as the House Minority Leader. But most recently, Beth, you have served on Obama's National Ocean Council. So this is a good time to talk with you about this transition and get insights from your experience. You know, with regard to climate change, what is most troubling to you?
Thank you, Rhonda. Great to be here. Great to be home. I was the director of the National Ocean Council in President Obama's Executive Office of the President for the last 2 years, and it was a deep honor to have been there. I have grave concern about what President Trump and his administration are going to do on climate change. I think the most recent actions of the EPA appointee, the gag order, the indication that grants will be cut are of grave concern to us all in Alaska. You know, we're ground zero for climate change in the U.S. Being an Arctic state, we're warming 2 to 4 times as fast as the rest of the country. So the deep concern I have is what is going to be the future in terms of climate change, in terms of reaching the deals that President Obama was so careful about making, in terms of trying to roll back the impacts that we have from climate change. You know, you only have to talk to people from Shishmaref or Kivalina to understand how impacted Alaska is. From ocean acidification to sea level rise to harmful algal blooms. These are things that can be devastating, and if we don't act on them, we are going to feel them, and we feel them harder than the rest of the country.
Let me ask you this. Thanks. What do we do if we feel differently than Donald Trump?
You know, as Alaskans, we've never shied away from a challenge, and we have a great ability to speak truth to power and to use science and to use our own knowledge. The indigenous knowledge in Alaska teaches us, the tribal knowledge teaches us what's happening, but each and every one of us has to lead now. We have to be sure our voices are heard so that we can continue to do the kind of work President Obama laid out so carefully to counteract climate change and literally save our state.
So are there some other issues that you've been watching on your radar screen?
Yes, thank you. I was really heartened by the Women's March and the thousands of women across Alaska speaking out, you know, to protect women's rights, to look at the Affordable Care Act. We have 36,000 Alaskans that can be affected if that's done away with without something strong to take its place. And you know, the research dollars that are coming into Alaska could go away. So we all have a duty to watch and to speak up. But I'm very, very proud of us. I'm proud to be home, but we can't lose sight. We are the state most impacted by climate change. President Obama had a deep commitment to working against climate change and to working with our tribes and indigenous people. And we must stand up for that.
All right, Beth, I want to thank you for joining us from Juneau, our sister station, KTVA. Well, up next, how two tribes worked with the Bureau of Land Management to protect millions of acres of land.
I'm 69 years old. I never thought I would see this day.
When we come back, how this land use agreement could affect other tribes. The Bureau of Land Management and two Gwich'in Athabascan communities recently finished a historic land use plan which encompasses more than 6 million acres and in some areas bans development. The land is deep into the heart of eastern Alaska's interior. And while there are no roads to get to Chalkitsik and Fort Yukon, the BLM invited us to fly with them to celebrate a plan 8 years in the making. We arrived in Chalkitsik in the early afternoon, just as the winter light began to fade. Most of these log homes are heated with wood, and although there is a store, most people here still live off the land. Chalkitsik in the Gwich'in language means place to hook a lot of fish.
Let us pray.
A sacred relationship.
And we give you thanks for giving us the land and our way of living.
About 80 people live in Chalkitsik and need a vast wilderness to survive.
We have the Brooks Range, which is north of us, the mountain range that divides us between here and the Arctic Ocean. And all the rivers that runs out of the Brooks Range runs into the Yukon River.
Chief Woody Salmon talks about a ride he took in a boat outfitted with one of the first outboard motors.
Back when I was a little kid, probably about like one of those little kid right there, as soon as we hit into Black River, he slows that down and everybody grabs their cup and take a drink.
People still do this, and Chalkitsik wants to keep it that way with a ban on mining. Although the Bureau of Land Management owns millions of acres in the eastern interior, it is so remote. The agency, when it first began this process 8 years ago, knew little about how people use the land to survive.
Down through the years, we've had a lot of elders come forward with their comments.
Thanks for inviting us.
Many of those elders died, but now their intimate knowledge of the land lives on.
Thank you.
And it's information that we learned that we're carrying forward because we're doing more of these land use plans.
As well as plans the BLM hopes to develop elsewhere in Alaska.
I think the coldest in December was minus 56.
It's tough to live here, isn't it?
Gets kind of cold, yeah.
Patricia Salmon says the land is the culture and the culture is the land, and both need protection.
People are starting to speak more English than Athabascan. So to me, it's really important that we continue to live off the land and hang on to what we have.
Chalkitsik worked hard with another tribe in the region, the Gwich'in in Fort Yukon, 50 miles to the west. It was dinner time when we arrived in Fort Yukon. A big batch of stew was served up, made with meat from a moose taken just days before.
We ask that you bless this food, and we ask that you bless each one as each one goes their way. Masi.
At first, the tribal consultation process between the BLM and the Gwich'in was full of conflict, partly because of the region's history. Fort Yukon was an important trade center in the interior, but was affected by mining pollution. Sarah Knutson told the gathering that as a child, she once saw mining runoff turn the Yukon River a mustard yellow. That's why the tribe has fought so hard to protect the land from future development.
My children and their children and generations after us will practically live off the land the same way I did, and they will be healthier for it.
Some of the food here was bought in town, but for the most part, the land is the store for the people here, and they can travel hundreds of miles in a day to find it.
The land is so vast that, if you didn't know where you're at, you didn't know your country, you'd get lost.
Michael Peter feels passionate about his connection to the land and wants his children to feel the same.
Blessed. Very.
The blessings of two worlds enjoyed yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The BLM says this tribal consultation process will soon come to other parts of our state, and their work with the Chalkitsik and Fort Yukon tribes will serve as a good template for future agreements. Well, joining us to flesh out some of the details about the Eastern Interior Agreement, Christy Williams, an attorney who worked with the tribes in this process, and Suzanne Little with the Pew Charitable Trust, which was also involved. Well, let's first of all start with your involvement in this.
Well, as a Gwich'in tribal citizen, it was very meaningful work to me. My family comes from Fort Yukon, and just watching the tribal leaders in this process over nearly a decade fighting the good fight to protect the traditional resources of the area was really humbling.
Well, let's sort of set the stage for people, show them a map to orient them, because we're talking about a heck of a lot of land involved here.
Yeah, it's 6.5 million acres within the entire resource management plan. The area that we were focused on is called the Drunjik, which means caches along the river, and that area is 2.4 million acres.
So the Drunjik is special to the people of this region. Does the name reveal why?
Well, a lot of the Gwich'in words carry deep meaning. There's one word that I like to try to pronounce. It's Chidri, and it means its heart. And there's a mountain outside of Vinatai that looks like a moose's heart, so it's named for that reason. So a lot of the names have deep meaning.
And Drunjik, why does that have special meaning in this process?
Drunjik the name was recently restored to its original name. It was formerly called the Black River. But the Drunjik name means caches along the river, and it's also the name of the people of Chalkitsik, so it carries an importance.
So how is it that the Pew Charitable Trust got involved in all of this? This doesn't seem like a project you'd expect to hear about.
Well, the Pew Charitable Trust is a large global nonprofit organization. We are concerned about government performance, oceans, fisheries, and to me, in this process, the important reason I was involved is that the people, the Alaska Native people who've lived with this land for over 10,000 years, it makes sense that, and they continue to survive with the land today. It makes sense that their voices would be given great weight in the management planning process. So I worked to help, if requested by tribes, to help tribal voices be heard in the planning process, which is very complex, took a long time, and I was honored to be able to do that work.
So the final product, this plan, how complicated is this plan?
So the plans in themselves, the actual resource management plans, they're very thick documents. We would receive multiple documents that were thousands of pages and have to analyze these documents. And fortunately, the tribes had a cooperating agency status, which allowed the tribes to analyze the documents before the public.
That's a lot for an average person. I'm sure that it's full of bureaucratic language.
It is. It's very complex language. It takes a lot of time to evaluate.
And land is complicated in Alaska, and we have a map of one of the areas, the 40-mile river area that was part of this. Now, what you can see there is sort of like a patchwork quilt of different inholdings, some from Native corporations. So there were apparently a lot of competing interests in this.
Certainly. There were competing interests, and The area that we were most concerned about, the Dronjik region, wasn't as controversial as some of the other regions like the 40 Mile, because it doesn't contain a lot of data on what is in the area. So we didn't have the same controversy as the 40 Mile region.
So the Bureau of Land Management is supposed to work with all different user groups. That's sort of their walking orders, and also to help with development. So with this 40 Mile area, you have the Doyon Native Corporation that wants to develop some of its inholdings. So how does all this get managed to everybody's advantage?
Well, the Bureau of Land Management has a multiple use mission, and that doesn't mean that all uses need to be happening on every acre, but it means that a balance of uses needs to be established in the plan. So BLM had to consider all sorts of different aspects, different opinions about how the land should be used. And I believe that they achieved a fairly balanced plan considering all the disparate opinions they had to deal with.
Well, I guess the big question is, why should we care about this? I mean, it's land that's far away, and we may never enter into it. I mean, I feel lucky that I got to visit, but most of us,
So these plans, the lifespan of a plan generally is 15 to 20 years. So a lot can happen. You think back 20 years ago, how much has happened in that time frame. So these plans are really the guiding principle for an agency on land management decisions. So it is important for us to get it right the first time, for the BLM and the tribes and all of the stakeholders involved to really have a meaningful voice at the table on how these plans will impact people.
Well, one of the things I guess that struck me is how much land people needed for subsistence, to basically shop in their store. And and if you live in Anchorage, you may go a few miles, but they're talking about hundreds of miles in a day. This is something that I guess none of us think about.
Absolutely, yeah. There isn't a Safeway out in the middle of rural Alaska. They have to travel along rivers that are often muddy, and the fish aren't always productive, and the moose aren't always plentiful. So this is a way of life.
So Suzanne, tell us a little bit about how this process that was developed might have implications elsewhere in our state.
Well, the process has actually been in place for a long time. BLM was just following the lawful processes that's established long ago. And there are 2 other active BLM land use plans underway now, both of them planning about 13 million acres of BLM land.
So even a bigger chunk of land in southwest Alaska, that's one of the areas.
Right, and then the central Yukon area also. So, tribes have already put their opinions forward, some tribes, about how they believe the land should be managed, and others will too. Development interests will put their opinions in, and BLM's job is to weigh all of those points of view and to achieve a plan going forward.
So what happens if a new President Trump just kind of tosses this by the wayside? What are the odds of 8 years of work into the Eastern Interior Plan?
It's a real unknown at this time. I have no idea how all that's going to tumble down. We just have to kind of wait and see. I know a lot of people will be concerned.
All right, well, I want to thank you very much, Suzanne Little and Christy Williams, for joining us. Well, we have covered a lot of territory in this week's Frontiers program. Hope you enjoyed your armchair journey. We'll see you next week.